Hi, everyone. Welcome to this discussion about Title IX. So let's talk Title IX. Before diving in, I'm very happy to report that we have special guest Paula Scanlan with us. Paula, do you want to unmute and turn your camera on?
Hi, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I should say, I don't know if Riley will be joining us. If she does, we'll be very excited. But in the meantime, we're very happy to have Paula Scanlan with us tonight. Thanks, Paula, for being here.
Of course, Riley actually just messaged me. She just said she's looking for the link. I'm just gonna text it to her right now if you don't mind.
Sure.
So just give me a moment and hopefully she'll join us in a second.
Great. Okay, so while we're waiting, Paula, can you remind us how old were you when you started swimming competitively?
I was 8 years old. And so it was so many years of my life, so many years of my parents' life. I'm actually at my parents' house right now, and there's actually a photo of me swimming up there from when we won our first ever state championship when I was in high school. And they had these like photos of us that they made. And anyway, what I'm saying is it was really a group effort. It was a lot of work on my end, but also my parents and my entire family sacrificing. And again, all of that was just to be able to swim D1. And of course, when I show up, there's a man on my team. So you can imagine how that felt.
Yep. All right. I want to welcome Riley Gaines. Hi, Riley. Thanks so
Hello.
Thanks so much for being here. So we're kicking things off with the question of how old you were when you started competitive swimming. Paula just said she was 8. How old were you, Riley?
Yeah, I started swimming when I was 4. Your typical like summer swim type thing, right? I did a lot of sports growing up. I come from a family of athletes, and so it was never a question if we played sports. It was what sports we played. My dad, he was a professional football player. My mom, she played softball, and so I did all the sports growing up. But I decided really, I mean, I was kind of between softball and swimming by the time I was 8, 10, 12 years old. That carried on through high school. And then I started getting recruited for college, and I was getting recruited for both softball and swimming. And that's when I had to ultimately make a decision, and I chose swimming. And now looking back, I wonder why I chose it, because I always knew swimming was harder than softball. Like objectively, like the practices, the pain we felt, like it was a much harder sport, I think. Um, but I think it was all in, God's timing, his plan. It was swimming has become a vessel for me to be where I'm at now. So
Awesome. Thank you both. Okay, so here's my follow-up question to that, which is when you both started swimming, and I'm sure you were in female-only teams throughout your career until recent events, how much did you know about Title IX when you were a girl or a teenager?
I actually did know a decent amount because I had an older grandmother who wasn't able to play sports. And so I remember she would always just say like, "Oh, you should be thankful for this thing called Title IX." And I was like, "What is that?" And when I was younger, I had this phase, and obviously it did not end up turning out this way, but I had this phase where I really was interested in the law. I was really interested in American history in particular. So all of those different things. I took AP US history in high school. I did really well on the exam, so I was definitely very interested about it, and I never thought it was something that would be questioned until actually 2020. I was taking a class in college, the one elective I was taking. It was a really random class, and we were talking about the Bostock versus Georgia case. And that's when I started to realize, okay, wait a minute, we might actually start to have a problem. And it was a year later that Thomas ended up joining my team. And of course, it was this big problem. And then the ruling came out and it was an even bigger issue. So, I definitely knew a little bit, but I would say probably most girls who were competing, at least in my high school, definitely were not aware of how women before us didn't even have those opportunities. So I think it's definitely something a lot of people in public are not fully aware of. And I do think like awareness needs to be raised to, yes, this is why it's important. And also this is what they're doing to rewrite it and why it's such an issue.
Awesome. How about you, Ryan? How much did you know about Title IX when you were coming through?
I knew nothing. I thought I knew what Title IX was. I mean, I really, the only thing that I thought Title IX did, I guess, and this is how I differ from Paula, is I wanted nothing to do with the law. Actually, one of my degrees is health law, but it was for dentistry. I mean, I wanted nothing to do with it. I wasn't interested in it. Boring, legal mumbo jumbo. I didn't care, to be honest with you. I didn't care at all, because I was able to compete. That was all that really mattered to me. I naively thought that it was a very long time ago when women couldn't compete. I mean, that didn't even occur to me that it really wasn't that long ago. 50 years to me sounded like a long time. And then senior year, this was the 50th anniversary of Title IX. And that's when the NCAA and our respective universities really started, now looking back, totally virtue signaling. They were giving us shirts, passing out shirts that said, equity, 50 years of celebrating equality. And that's when I was like, okay, well, you know, that's what this is. It afforded us the right to be able to compete, to succeed, equal opportunities to men. And it was at that same national championships where they allowed Thomas. I wish I had the shirt with me. I could probably go find it. Literally, they passed out a shirt that said 50 years of opportunities for women. Every participant at the NCAA championships got it. And I'm looking at this shirt. I'm looking at this 6'4" man standing on the block next to me, his feet taking up the entire block, a bulge in his women's swimsuit. And I realized this organization that I had trusted, that I had naively believed had my best interest. It was in that moment where I was like, hold on, they don't have my best interest. They don't really care about opportunities for women, because if they did, they would see the injustice of allowing this man to compete with us. So I just, to be honest, I was never interested in Title IX until I was negatively impacted by, I guess, the removal of such procedures. Sorry, my dog thought that was a doorbell. That noise.
That's all right. Thank you both so much. I know you have to go. We only have you for a few minutes. Paula, you were an undergrad, of course, at UPenn when you learned firsthand about men being permitted to compete in women's sports. And as you know, I went to Penn Law School, and I'm not sure if I will ever forgive my alma mater for what they did to you and your teammates. If you can, just say a little bit about what it was like for you at Penn in the fall of 2021.
Well, Kara, let me give you one thing you should forgive Penn Law School for. They didn't admit Thomas when he tried to apply. So if you ever need one thing to hold on to, that's the one. But yeah, man, it's so hard to even summarize this in a few words. It's the better question is what they didn't do to us. But in my experience there, the university said all 35 of us on the team, all 35 true females, we were the problem, and it was whatever we had to do was to accommodate Thomas's feelings. They told us that there was nothing we could do about it. They compared him being part of the team to the newest civil rights movement, and they said we would be discriminating against someone based on their race was the same thing as not wanting to undress in a locker room with a 6'4" tall man 18 times every single week. We were subjected to doing this. And again, they had follow-up meetings with us, preaching inclusion, telling us we were hateful bigots. And the worst thing that they did is they said, and if you continue to have a problem with this, here's the number for student psychological services, go make yourself an appointment. And again, this continued all season long, and nobody wanted to talk about it. Even before they started bringing in these meetings, you could have one-on-one conversations with girls on the team. And it was just completely crazy. After they came in, nobody would even have one-on-one conversations because they say, no, I can't say that. I'm hateful. I don't want to, be a bigot. And they didn't just do this to myself at the University of Pennsylvania. They did this to all the other Ivy League athletes. Riley can touch in a minute on what they even did to her at Kentucky. And so again, the university did nothing to stand up for us. And let me just tell you about the response of the university quickly. They were so proud of this. They thought they were part of this huge progressive movement that they continued to feature Thomas's accomplishments on social media, all the time. They're posting pictures of him winning all these events, demolishing girls. And the last thing that they did that shows that these institutions stood by what they did is they nominated Thomas, a man, for NCAA Woman of the Year. Each school gets a few nominees, and they chose a 6'4" tall man to be nominated for the greatest honor of an NCAA athlete. Again, Riley can touch on that too. I think she was a nominee one year. And so that just shows it wasn't that they even, oh, we were uncomfortable about the situation. No, they loved the fact that they had a man taking our opportunities, and they were proud of it, and they wanted to highlight it. So I think if that tells you anything about where a lot of these higher ed institutions are, I think that should summarize really truly that they are willing to allow men to take these opportunities from us, and they are proud of it, and they're going to continue to do it until we stand up to them.
Yeah, just to touch on the NCAA Woman of the Year thing very briefly, to put into perspective, this is the most prestigious honor for any collegiate female athlete. The most prestigious. It encompasses your, of course, your athletic achievement, but far beyond that, it encompasses your academic success, your community service. It really is just an award that showcases a well-rounded person and leader. Of the, I believe, over 250,000 female Division I female athletes, there were less than 500. I mean, that's not even 0.1%. I don't know the actual number, but it's a very, very small percentage. UPenn got one nominee of all of their teams across their entire campus, all of their female teams, and they chose that the best female athlete among, again, softball, swimming, basketball, soccer, they said their best female athlete that they had on their campus was Leah Thomas. Again, academic success, I believe his GPA, Paula would know, was like a 2.0. Like,
it's why he couldn't get into the Penn Law School. He was almost academically ineligible, and that's not considered into this nomination.
No, it was by other schools. And yeah, I was honored when I received this nomination from University of Kentucky. I was the SEC Scholar Athlete of the Year, 4.0 SEC Community Service Leader of the Year. I had hundreds and hundreds of hours in community service, SEC record holder, one of the fastest Americans of all time. I mean, I dedicated myself to becoming a well-rounded individual, not because I wanted the award, no, but because it mattered to me. My academics, all these things, they mattered to me. When I found out the full list of nominees, immediately this award meant nothing. It meant nothing to me. I didn't even want it. It was devalued entirely. So that's speaking to that. And I will say, like, how I think Paula and I's experiences were, of course, there's a ton of parallels in what we faced in terms of the muzzling, right? Like, I had to go to training, sensitivity training. They sat me down. They taught me how to use she, her pronouns. Clearly, it didn't work. I had to keep going through this training until they were satisfied with how I was performing. All of that mumbo jumbo. Our coaches were silenced. I will say my coach was incredibly supportive of me. My athletic director was incredibly supportive of me. He's a large part in why I spoke out, because I called him after seeing this firsthand, experiencing the injustice and the blatant violation of Title IX and the sex-based discrimination that we faced as women. And I called my athletic director, who's been the AD at Kentucky for 20 plus years. And I said, hey, Mitch, this is what happened. This is how we feel. How do you feel if I take a public stand and acknowledge how this is wrong? And he said, Riley, I love you. I support you. I would support whatever stand you took. But this makes me proud. Stay true to your convictions, speak your heart, and don't worry about painting this university in a bad light, because we're behind you. So I had incredible, tremendous support from my athletic department, but that's not what we faced from the academia side of our institution, which I would imagine that's, at least in speaking, I can't speak to Ivy Leagues. Those are a different breed, as I think has been made pretty well aware this past few months, even with everything going on in the Middle East, different things. But SEC schools, I would imagine that's the approach. And talking to my friends on different teams, that's the same consensus. Their coaches, they knew this was wrong. The athletic directors, anyone who understood sports or who has played sports knew this was wrong. But it was the academia side of our universities that continually suppressed our voices.
Understood. Thank you. And of course, now Riley and several of the other women who competed in the NCAAs in 2022 are suing the NCAA, which is great. And WDI USA is very proud to support that lawsuit. And we look forward to hearing more about that going forward. Okay, Riley and Paula, do we have time for any audience questions if there are any, or do you need to go?
No, come on.
Okay, if anyone has a question, please put it in the Q&A and Lorraine will do her best to track and pose the questions to Paula and Riley. And I will just say, while Lorraine is working on that, while Paula was talking about how Penn administrators treated Thomas competing in the women's team as a civil rights issue, Lorraine, who is the coordinator of the WDI USA Black Women's Caucus, was just shaking her head in what appears to be thorough disgust. To compare what is going on today with the Black civil rights struggle is just disgusting. It really is. Okay, Lorraine, do we have any questions from the audience?
We have one question from Shannon. First, she just said that she wrote letters in support to you, Riley, when all of this hoopla was going on. And she asked, do you think that, or for both of you, do you think that swab tests would be best for sports or any kind of blanket testing to test athletes, I guess, to determine
I mean,
sex?
I think it would, but the thing is, and Riley can agree with this, we had to go through physicals to be on the team. I remember I showed up to school multiple weeks early before our season even started in the beginning of August to do these athletic physicals. And they divided us up by male and female, and we got the female doctors to look at us and ask us questions, and the men's team got the men's doctor. And by the way, at this time, Will Thomas was over there with the men. So they know, I know, everybody knows. So I don't even think that would be necessary, but if people, I mean, there's some crazy activists that try to claim it's like discriminatory to have these tests done. If for some reason people find the swab test quote unquote less invasive, then I would be happy to do that too. But again, we already have all these things in measures, things in place and all these measures to already know that.
Yeah, this is, I would say, I think especially for elite level competitions like the Olympics or some sort of international, international competitions, it's what they've done historically is a simple cheek swab, which is chromosomal testing. It checks your chromosomes. They switched this up. A wonderful expert on this really is Linda Blade, specifically to speaking how the Olympics handle these issues. She's amazing. So I encourage everyone to go look her up and kind of see what she says about this more specifically. She's obviously more knowledgeable about this stuff than I, but I believe it was 1964, somewhere in the 1960s, whatever year that was, where they, instead of cheek swabbing, they did do genital inspections, which is incredibly invasive. That is humiliating. That is embarrassing. That is an awful way to determine sex. I think everyone should be able to agree on this. They only did it that one Olympics. They decided very quickly that this was invasive, but then they stopped testing entirely. And that's where now we have seen, outside of even the argument and the debate of people who identify as trans, but we have seen now people with DSDs infiltrate, specifically in track and field. The last Olympic, or I believe in 2016, maybe 2020, the top 3 finishers in the women's 800 all had Y chromosomes, which again, it shows how this debate isn't anti-trans. Anyone who is biologically male should not be competing with the women. That includes someone like Caster Semenya. Of course, there's a conversation to be had about how we do handle this, but nonetheless, it's unfair, and that's what the argument is. Polls show, I forget what the poll is. Again, Linda Blade has the number specifically, but of a large poll of Olympic athletes, I think it was over 85% wanted cheek swab testing. So I think it's a wonderful, not invasive way to determine who you are down to a chromosomal level, to ensure safety, to ensure fairness. And I don't understand how that's controversial, why we want everyone to compete where it's safe and where it's fair.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any more questions before we let Paula and Riley go on with their evening?
Yes, we have a question from Fernanda. have either of you heard from young women who are just completely discouraged, maybe even not even going into sports or deciding not to go into sports because it's just, you know, a losing battle trying to compete against men?
I have heard of it all of the time. I'm going to read you a message I got this morning, actually. Let me find it really quick. It's a girl who actually does beauty pageants. And she says, you know, it's a lot more than what I think people understand is we have interviews and we have, you know, you walk on the stage in a bikini and fitness tests and different things. And she says, men have now started to be able to do these pageants with us. And she said, I'm so discouraged that I'm not doing them anymore. I don't want to have to get on the stage and look at the person to my left or to my right, or oftentimes she said even be flanked on both sides by people who have a bulge in their bikini on the stage. And she said, it's just not worth it to me. And I get that. That was this morning. I get it every single day from parents, from young girls saying, what's the point? Those West Virginia girls, I remember my heart broke. Those 5 girls in West Virginia, they reached out to me before they decided to ultimately concede and not compete against the boy. And they said, the verbiage they used was, are we not worthy of calling ourselves champions? Do we have to fight for second place? These girls are 13 years old, 13 years old, and they understood loud and clear that the message being sent to them was that they are not worthy. What a harmful, deteriorating, demeaning, degrading message to send to young middle school age girls. That's what they understood. I didn't tell them that. I didn't tell them that that's what was being told. That's the conclusion they drew. And that broke my heart to hear that. I get it every day. I really do. People who say, what's the point?
Paula, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I was gonna bring that up. I was actually with the West Virginia girls a couple of days ago. I think we have heard of pro athletes and younger wanting to quit, and I think that's my biggest thing is I said this outright in one of my first interviews. If I was subjected to this at age 15, 16, I would have quit and never made it to college because I would have said, what is the point? I don't want to change in a locker room with a fully intact man who might be predatory, might not be, but either way, I don't want to lose my opportunities. I don't want to be fighting for third or second place or whatever it might be because you already know the outcome. And so again, I think that that's really why this is so important is it's about these younger girls that are going to be discouraged from joining altogether. Not just violated in their bathrooms or locker room, not just loss of their opportunities to be an All-American or whatever it might be. No, they're going to be encouraged to not compete altogether. And that's a greater disservice than anything myself or Riley even went through. So again, that's why this is so important. It's for that next generation.
And people can say that sports are about morale and camaraderie and friendship, which, you know, when you're younger, sure. But when you're competing middle school, high school, college, it's not about your friends. It's not about how you feel. My coach never asked me one time at 4:30 in the morning, you know, do you feel like jumping in this cold pool today? No, that's not what it's about. It's about winning. It's just, that's what it's about. So.
All right, thanks so much. For anyone who doesn't know, the West Virginia girls they're referring to are a bunch of middle school athletes who basically forfeited their shot put meet because they're being forced to compete against a boy called BPJ. This is all at the center of a lawsuit that a lot of people think might make it to the Supreme Court. We'll see if it does. Okay, I think with that, we should let you go. You're both more than welcome to stay, but we're going to sort of dive into the history and details of Title IX at this point. So it's up to you. Thank you so much to both of you for spending some time with us today.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Kara.
everybody. You guys are the best. We love you, Kara,
Yes,
and
Kara,
Lorraine,
you're
and everyone
amazing.
on. So thank you.
Love everyone, and thank you for being part of this fight. We appreciate all of you.
We're not going to stop.
I know. All right, I'll see you soon.
All right, so thanks so much to Paula and Riley for being here. That was great to hear from them. I do want to get into some of the nitty-gritty of Title IX so that we all know sort of what's going on in the state of play, because there's a lot going on. So I'm going to read some parts of a blog post that WDI USA posted earlier this week that some of you may have seen, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So for anyone who doesn't know, Title IX refers to Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. It reads very simply, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefit of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. It was enacted into law and signed by President Nixon in 1972. Although it has come to be associated primarily with women's sports, its original intention was to protect women and girls throughout the educational arena, and it's still meant to do that. One of its primary authors and fiercest proponents was Representative Patsy Mink, a Japanese-American woman born on a Hawaii sugar plantation who eventually made her way to the House of Representatives. When she died in 2002, the law was renamed in her honor. So although we all still refer to it as Title IX, its official name is the Patsy Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act. In 1975, under President Ford, the U.S. Department of Education promulgated implementing regulations to govern enforcement of Title IX in the nation's schools. Those regulations explicitly permit sex separation under certain circumstances. For example, recipients of federal funding under Title IX may maintain sex-specific housing facilities, toilet, locker room, and shower facilities, human sexuality classes, scholarships, and sports teams where selection for such teams is based on competitive skill or the activity involved is a contact sport. In other words, in 1975, the U.S. Department of Education understood that when equality of the sexes is the goal, separating students by sex makes sense under certain circumstances. This is all what's at stake with recent Biden administration rule changes. Now, going back a little bit, in May 2016, the Departments of Justice and Education both issued a Dear Colleague letter to schools across the country, instructing school officials to interpret the word sex in Title IX to include gender identity, where gender identity was defined to mean, quote, an individual's internal sense of gender. Few people were aware at that time that Democratic Party officials were already trying to obliterate sex in Title IX by redefining it to include the vacuous, sexist, and homophobic concept of gender identity. Later that year, 2016, the radical feminist organization Women's Liberation Front sued the administration, arguing that the Dear Colleague letter was procedurally flawed and constituted unlawful sex discrimination. I was on the Wolf Board of Directors at the time and contributed to the drafting of the complaint. Then, November 8th, 2016 happened, and the incoming administration eventually withdrew the Dear Colleague letter. At that time, the lawsuit was dismissed without objection because at that time, there was nothing to sue over. Now, two different federal courts issued rulings last week concerning various moves the Biden administration has made in recent years to obliterate the meaning of the word sex in Title IX. But the rulings are very different in scope and in impact. And so in order to understand why, we need to understand what the Biden administration has done since taking office with the intention of obliterating sex under Title IX. As many of us know, on January 20th, the first day of taking office, the administration issued Executive Order 13988 on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. That order stated it's the policy of the administration to interpret the word sex to include gender identity for all purposes under federal administrative law. To justify this policy, the administration relied on the Supreme Court 2020 ruling in a case called Bostock versus Clayton County, which Paula referred to earlier. The Biden administration's reliance on Bostock for this purpose was completely misplaced. However, that hasn't stopped the administration from lying to the American people about what Bostock said for the past 3 years. The order went on to mandate that every single federal agency rewrite all its rules to redefine sex to include gender identity. So in the first 6 months of 2021, the administration issued no fewer than 3 guidance documents, sometimes referred to as memos, orders, or fact sheets, telling educational institutions across the country that they have to interpret the word sex to include gender identity for all Title IX purposes. Now, these are generally referred to as the 2021 guidance documents. It did all this without issuing any public notice or opportunity for comment, in complete violation of federal procedural law. In the summer of 2021, 20 states sued the administration for this in federal court in Tennessee. WDI USA filed a friend of the court brief agreeing with the states that the administration's 2021 guidance documents were procedurally flawed, and adding that they constituted unlawful sex discrimination under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In September 2022, the federal district court agreed with the state's procedural arguments and blocked the 2021 guidance documents from taking effect in the states that had sued, without addressing our arguments about sex discrimination, unfortunately. The administration appealed the case to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, which affirmed the district court's decision last week. So the 2021 guidance documents have already not been in effect in roughly half the states since 2021, recently confirmed by the Sixth Circuit. So by 2022, the Biden administration had figured out that if it was going to obliterate the material reality of sex under Title IX, it was at least going to have to comply with applicable federal procedural law. So in June 2022, it announced new changes to the Title IX regulations, and this time it managed to give notice and an opportunity for public comment. Like the 2021 guidance documents, these proposed changes would obliterate sex in the law by redefining the word sex to include gender identity for all Title IX purposes. The Department of Education received over 200,000 public comments to that proposed rule, which is more than any other rule in the history of the department. And I'm proud to say that WDI USA encouraged our thousands of supporters, many of whom are most likely here now, explaining to submit public comments, explaining why obliterating the material reality of sex is bad for women and girls. Now, people who follow these matters closely waited anxiously to see what the department would do. And in April of this year, it made the changes final, effective August 1st, 2024. And this is what I refer to as the final April 2024 rule changes. So as of writing, as of today, the 1975 regulations are still in place, but depending on what happens in the next few weeks, starting this August, schools all over the country may be required to pretend that sex isn't real and that some men are actually women if they have what they call a woman gender identity. If the administration's final April 2024 rule changes survive, schools will be required to force female athletes to compete with and against male athletes who claim to have a woman gender identity. Female students all over the country will be required to share housing units, toilets, showers, and locker rooms with men who claim to be women. Now, on June 11th, a federal court in Texas issued a ruling in the matter of Texas versus Cardona. Various media outlets ran with headlines designed to make people think that the court had thrown out the final April 2024 rule changes, and a lot of people who care about women and girls as a sex class understandably got very excited. It would have been great if the Texas court had done that. But that's not what happened. All that particular court really did was block the 2021 guidance documents from taking effect in the state of Texas. Now that's great if you care about women and girls in Texas, and we all do. But the court's ruling did not affect the final April 2024 rule changes at all, and its scope did not extend beyond Texas. However, 2 days later, something very interesting happened. On June 13th, a different federal court in Louisiana issued a ruling in the matter of Louisiana versus Department of Education that did affect the final April 2024 rule changes. The court blocked those changes from taking effect in Louisiana, Mississippi, Montana, and Idaho, because those are the 4 states that had sued in that case. That's a big deal, and everyone who cares about women and girls should celebrate. And the ruling is a great one if you care about women and girls as a sex class and/or freedom of speech, because the judge ruled that the plaintiff states are likely to succeed on the merits of their claims that the Biden administration's final April 2024 rules unlawfully rewrote Title IX by redefining sex and impinged on the free speech rights of students and parents not to use so-called preferred pronouns if they don't want to. This is a big win if you care about these things, and we all do. Then, literally while I was writing this blog post earlier this week on June 17th, a different federal court, this time the District Court for the Eastern District of Kentucky, issued yet another ruling blocking the final April 2024 rules from taking effect in Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia, Ohio, and Indiana. Now, this is an incredible ruling, and these are the opening paragraphs of the ruling. Quote, "There are two sexes, male and female. More than 50 years ago, Congress recognized that girls and women were not receiving educational opportunities that were equal to those afforded to their male counterparts. It attempted to remedy this historical inequity through the passage of the Education Amendments of 1972, commonly known as Title IX. And for more than 50 years, educational institutions across the country risk losing federal funding if they fail to comply with the dictates of the statute. This case concerns an attempt by the executive branch to dramatically alter the purpose and meaning of Title IX through rulemaking. But 6 states, an association of Christian educators, and one 15-year-old girl object. Incidentally, the one 15-year-old girl being referred to is one of the middle school students that Paula was talking about earlier. As they correctly argue, the new rule contravenes the plain text of Title IX by redefining sex to include gender identity, violates government employees' First Amendment rights, and is the result of arbitrary and capricious rulemaking. If the new rule is allowed to take effect on August 1st, 2024, all plaintiffs will suffer immediate and irreparable harm. That's fancy legalese. We can talk about it if you'd like. Because the plaintiffs are likely to prevail on the merits of their claims and the public interest and equities highly favor their position, the new rule will be enjoined and its application stayed, which effectively means that it blocked the final April 2024 rule changes in the plaintiff states. One very interesting thing about this ruling is that the very first sentence, "There are two sexes, male and female," has a footnote on it. And the footnote reads, "The defendants," by which the court means the Department of Education, "made this concession during oral arguments on the plaintiff's motion for injunctive relief. The parties have agreed to little else." So this is very good news for women and girls, and I'm happy to see the Biden administration concede that there are two sexes. So here's where things stand as of today. The 2021 guidance documents are not in effect in the 21 states that sued to block them, including Texas. They are in effect in the remainder of the states. But as far as I can tell, these guidance documents are no longer really even all that relevant because the administration's final April 2024 rule changes fix the procedural problems with those guidance documents by curing their procedural flaws and doing what it has to do under federal law by issuing notice and opportunity for comment. Even so, the final April 2024 rule changes are flawed for other reasons, as the Louisiana federal court told us last week, and the Kentucky federal court has now confirmed. The final April 2024 rule changes attempt to rewrite Title IX unlawfully by redefining sex, violate the First Amendment, and are arbitrary and capricious. There are 5 other lawsuits floating around that are similar to the ones out of Louisiana and Kentucky. And as of today, the final April 2024 rules have been blocked in 10 states. It's anyone's guess what will happen before the final April 2024 rule changes take effect as scheduled on August 1st, but I, for one, am feeling optimistic. So we can open it up for questions and discussion if anybody wants to ask a question or share a comment.
We have a very interesting question from Leslie in the QA. And she asks, Kara, since there is a clear split in enforcement of the Biden administration's guidelines across the country, what do you think is a likely timeline for review by the Supreme Court?
I think it depends in part on whether we're talking about the 2021 guidance or the 2024 final rule changes. If we're talking about the final 2024 rule changes, I'm actually not aware of a circuit split. I'm only aware of, well, and none have gone to the circuits at all yet. I'm only aware of these 2 cases, one out of Louisiana and one out of Kentucky, both federal district courts that hold that the Biden final 2024 rule changes are unlawful. I assume that the administration will appeal both of those rulings and they'll go before the circuits. But it's really anyone's guess as to the timeline for when the Supreme Court will look at this. But in the meantime, there are other cases that might force the Supreme Court to show its hand, meaning one, the BPJ case that I mentioned earlier. This is BPJ versus West Virginia, where West Virginia has a law in the books that says no boys or men in women's or girls' sports. BPJ is a young man who challenged that law, and he lost at the district court level, but he won before the Fourth Circuit. And so a lot of people think that case will go before the Supreme Court. In addition, there is a huge question as to whether the 2020 decision in Bostock versus Clayton County applies to Title IX. That is where there is a very significant split amongst the federal courts, with just under half saying that the Bostock decision does apply to Title IX, and just over half saying the Bostock decision does not apply to Title IX. We haven't gotten into what Bostock says, and we could do that if we want. But the point there is just saying that the Supreme Court has to take this on at some point. It has to tell us whether sex is real under Title IX. And I don't know how much longer they can put that off. And in the meantime, one more thing I'll say on this is the Supreme Court is currently considering whether to take up the case of LW versus Scrimeti. LW versus Scrimeti is not a Title IX case. It's a case out of Tennessee, where the state of Tennessee has a rule, has a law in the books prohibiting puberty blockers and wrong sex hormones in minors. And a group of minors and their parents and one doctor sued the state. And I forget what happened at the district court level, but I do know that the Sixth Circuit ultimately issued an incredibly strong opinion saying that the phrase transgender people does not constitute a sufficiently coherent group of people to justify elevated scrutiny under equal protection, which is a whole other set of laws. But that's going to be a very difficult question for the Supreme Court to confront. I hope that answers your question, Leslie.
She just had one follow-up question. Is there any way that the Supreme Court might consolidate all of those cases for different sets of rule changes?
That's a great question. As far as I know, at this time, the only case on this topic that is currently before the Supreme Court on the court is currently considering whether to take it at all. It hasn't even decided to take it. That's LW versus Scrimeti. I'm not aware of any other case addressing this topic that's currently before the Supreme Court at all. I can say that in the past, the court has declined to take up cases where various people are arguing about whether schools can maintain single-sex bathrooms, which is extremely disappointing. They refused to take a case called Doe versus Boyertown, which came out of a federal court in Pennsylvania, where a bunch of students didn't like their school's policy of allowing mixed-sex bathrooms. The Supreme Court just ignored that case. Even more recently, there was a case called AC versus Martinsville, where a female student demanded access to the boys' bathrooms and the school said no. So AC, who's a female student, sued. And that case eventually went before the Seventh Circuit, which ruled that schools may maintain mixed-sex bathrooms. And the Supreme Court had the opportunity to take that up as well, and it declined. So I'm frustrated that the Supreme Court hasn't taken the cases where they could have addressed these questions, and seems to be sitting on at least one case right now where it could address it. But I also understand that the Supreme Court is in a bit of a bind because it's caused a lot of problems. It created an absolute nightmare with the 2020 decision in Bostock.
We have a question from Elizabeth R. What can people in the other 40 states do while we wait for the 10 states cases to be decided? If those states cases win, how will it affect the other 50 states? Elizabeth, I just want to say that you read my mind because I had a similar question.
So for the 5 cases that are currently floating around the country, where there have not been rulings yet, I don't know which states are included in those cases. My best guess is that they're generally red states. What can you be doing? I mean, to the extent that you can, please educate yourself about, what those other cases say and what they are, and share information with your friends and colleagues wherever you live, because these issues are important to women and girls as a sex class, everywhere around the country, and this stuff can be incredibly confusing. But the bottom line is that the Biden April 2024 final rule changes redefined sex to include gender identity for all Title IX purposes, and it did so following the applicable procedural law. So we no longer have the argument that the department failed to provide notice and an opportunity for comment, because they did. They actually followed the applicable procedural law in that case. And so to a certain extent, we're stuck with what the Biden administration finalized in April 2024. But there's still time before the effective date of August 1st, 2024. So tell everyone in your life what's going on. Please tell everyone what's going on and what it really means. A lot of people don't understand what it means to redefine sex to include gender identity. What it means is the complete obliteration of women and girls as a sex class.
This question is from Esmilda. Has the military distinction of the male draft been discussed or addressed during these guidance discussions? We are clear regarding sex, regarding the draft registration. In other words, how does it apply to,
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not aware of that coming up in the course of any of this litigation. I know that Women's Liberation Front and WDI USA have referred to that issue in some of our briefing. For anyone who doesn't know, the United States government knows what sex means when it comes to the military draft. Its current policy is still that everyone born male has to register for the draft at the age of 8, not for the draft, for the selective service, excuse me, has to register with selective service at the age of 18, and everyone born female does not.
Right.
So the government knows what sex means.
absolutely.
And we could be, to her point, we could be using that more in our advocacy for sure.
Can you speculate about why the court has not taken up the issue with respect to schools? And she wants to know, this is Leslie, she wants to know, was it because the plaintiffs were trans identified girls? Notice my quotes.
So the Supreme Court is, it's got a serious problem with respect to what it said in Bostock versus Clayton County, where it ruled that transgender, but it didn't rule, it said that it assumed that transgender and the phrase transgender status have a meaning that we all understand. It never defined those terms. And so it's got a serious problem because all of these cases are sort of bubbling up to the surface, and it's going to have to deal with that problem, the problem it created in 2020. And I think it really doesn't want to be totally honest. I just think the court does not want to have to deal with that issue. Something else, I guess I would say, I was talking with the lawyer in Riley's case against the NCAA, and I asked him this question, and he said, and it frustrates me if he's right. He said that it's blatantly obvious to most Americans why allowing male athletes to compete in women's sports is unfair, but it's less obvious to most Americans why allowing men into women's intimate spaces like bathrooms is a problem. I hope he's wrong about that, because if he's right, that is really distressing. If people genuinely cannot see that allowing men into intimate female-only spaces like bathrooms and locker rooms is a problem, then we've got a really serious issue on our hands.
This question is from Fern. I'm curious to know if women and girls are losing the right to fair sport competition. What rights can the trans activists come for next? Is this going to escalate further? We already cannot peacefully assemble without being attacked, such as in the cases of WDIs, NVDAs, and even the Taking Back Title IX bus being vandalized. It almost seems like the end goal is de facto intimidation, where women remove themselves from public places. So what's next?
So for anyone who doesn't know about the bus being vandalized, the Independent Women's Forum is sponsoring a summer bus tour where there's a bus traveling across the country saying things like equality is not a game, take back Title IX. And several women affiliated with WDI USA have spoken at some of the stops along the tour and will continue to do so. Last night, the bus was vandalized, and whoever did it, I don't know who the perpetrators are, whoever did it just wrote horrifically misogynistic and homophobic things all over the bus. One person drew a picture of male genitalia on the bus. It's just disgusting. So to Fern's question, are they trying to intimidate us? Absolutely. That is definitely one of the aims. And what we all have to realize is that the reason that they do that is they have no coherent arguments. They just have no coherent arguments as to why they think some men are women and some women are men. I mean, none of it makes any sense. And so that's why they cannot let us have a voice. Now, I think something about this, and we could talk about it, and maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. But the what I call Trantifa, or, you know, the gender zealots, whatever we want to call them,
Yep.
for the most part, they don't go after conservatives. Now that's changing a little bit, but for the most part, it has suited them to let the media paint this entire discussion as a fight between the so-called big bad Christian right on the one hand and a tiny marginalized community on the other hand. They hate us much more than they hate conservatives, because if mainstream liberal America could hear the leftist feminist arguments against enshrining gender identity in the law, we would win. And so they can't have that. And that's exactly why they try to shut us down and intimidate us.
This question is from Alice. Who else has the standing to sue about this? Other than state governments, who else can sue and just stop this whole thing, hopefully?
It's a good question, and I don't know that I know the answer. I can tell you that when Wolf filed its lawsuit in 2016, there was a mother-daughter team, a woman who was on the faculty of a school, and her daughter attended the school, and I believe was an athlete herself, and they were the plaintiffs in that case. So can individuals sue? Quite possibly. I just don't know the answer to that. Could we all sue? Maybe, but it's the states that have the money, it's the states that have the institutional support, and it's the states that have the time. Litigation like this is incredibly complex. It's not something I've ever even engaged in. I have written plenty of amicus briefs for both WDI USA and Wolf, and I'm happy to keep doing that to the extent that anyone wants me to. But complex litigation is an enormous undertaking that requires a skill set that most of us don't have. I know that I don't. So I don't know who has standing to sue, and I don't know who would know the answer to that. Although Riley's lawyer in her case against the NCAA would have some ideas.
Question from Elizabeth. If Trump were to win in the next election, would he be able to undo the Title IX rewrite fairly easily? We hear a lot that, of what he, wants to do, but can he actually do that?
So the president can withdraw every single one of the 2021 guidance documents. The current president issued them without following any laws, and so they can quite easily be retracted by any future president who wants to retract them. The 2024 final rule changes are different, because should they go into effect on August 1st as scheduled, they will be final rules that have gone through the proper procedural, the proper process. They were put out lawfully. They received, they gave the public notice and an opportunity for comment. The public commented. Many of us suspect that the administration just ignored the public comments, which is extremely unfortunate for our position, but it's not something that they can't do. So the bottom line is that if the new rules go into effect August 1st, there'll be final regulations. And then what will happen is an incoming president would have to start the process all over again and issue new public rules for notice and an opportunity for public comment. So yes, the president can undo this, but it's much more burdensome than simply withdrawing a guidance document.
This question is from Lauren. What do you think are the chances of the number of Supreme Court justices being increased by the Biden administration in order to have a more lefty court?
I have absolutely no idea if that's even happening. So I don't know.
Okay. We've all heard, or most of us have heard about the new group, Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender. Can they be effective at all?
So I really like the new group, Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender. I have to say WDI USA is, of course, a nonpartisan organization. Speaking solely for myself, I'm a lifelong Democrat, except for a short time when I was a member of the California Green Party. So I really like what Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender is doing, and I am confident that they are doing all they can to make as much noise as possible. Like WDI USA, they are all volunteers. And for various reasons that I am not in a position to share, most of the leadership has to be anonymous. So that makes it difficult for them to achieve effective change. If you're anonymous, it's hard for people to know whether to take you seriously.
Mm-hmm. The next question is from Anonymous, and I hope that we understand this correctly. And Anonymous asked, is there an easy link to the 21 rule changes Biden made? I'm wondering if she is asking for a direct link or...
I mean, there were several of them. So somewhere that will exist. So for example, since early 2021, I've been writing about those guidance documents. And I know that WDI USA has written some about those guidance documents. So I'm sure there's a record in the WDI USA blog about them, but I'm not aware of one place that contains all of them. And by the way, the Biden administration didn't just do this under Title IX. During the same first 6 months of 2021, the Department of Health and Human Services issued guidance documents telling doctors and nurses all over the country that they have to interpret the word sex to include gender identity. The Department of Housing and Urban Development issued guidance documents to any recipients of federal funding under the Fair Housing Act, advising all of them that they have to redefine sex to include gender identity for their housing purposes. So it wasn't just Title IX that did this. The Biden administration spent the first 6 months of 2021 obliterating women and girls as a sex class in any way that he was able to do.
Next question is from Nina. What about going to the World Court instead of Nations Court? Like maybe instead of the Supreme Court, maybe the UN or something, or...
So I don't know much about international human rights law. I know that WDI, the international organization, is doing quite a bit of lobbying with the United Nations. And I know some women affiliated with WDI International who do know a lot about international human rights law, which I do not. I also know, unfortunately, that the United Nations is almost entirely captured by so-called gender identity. This stuff is global. You know, it all stems, or much of it stems from a document called the Yogyakarta Principles, which were launched in 2006 and told essentially everybody in the world that they had to interpret the word sex to include gender identity. So I'm not sure that that would get us much. And I guess I would also just say that one way in which we have it slightly easier than some of our turban sisters around the world is our First Amendment. And so women all over the world are getting hit with these hate speech laws and told that they're not allowed to call men men. So far, we don't have that problem here. And I hope that continues to be that way. In fact, there are some pretty solid rulings out of United States federal courts that hold that forcing public employees to use so-called preferred pronouns is a violation of free speech. A lot of that litigation is happening in schools, but I feel reasonably confident that we can do a lot of good work in US courts.
This question is from Alice. It's also much broader than Title IX. Other federal agencies and policies have also have to use or utilize gender within the definition of sex. Is that true?
Yes, it is very much true. Yeah. Maybe I was anticipating that question when I talked about the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Yes, it's absolutely true.
Okay. This is an interesting one. I actually thought about this too. could a freedom of religion or belief argument win in the US, like the case of Maya Forstater in the UK?
So freedom of religion cases have seen some success in US courts. The applicability of the Forstater case here in the US is really quite tricky because the relief that she got had to do with the legality under the UK's Equality Act of terminating her employment because of speech that she made. But her employer was a private entity. And I'm not aware of any similar law that exists in the US that would protect us for the reasons articulated in the Forstater case about having gender critical views being worthy of respect in a democratic society. So it's a bit complicated. I think it's worth pursuing. Someone with more experience in employment law than I have, which is a lot of people because I have none, it would be great for someone to dive into that question.
If it's even possible, how can we get every state on these Title IX lawsuits from Anonymous?
I am not confident that majority blue states are going to join these lawsuits. I wish that I were wrong about that, and I hope to be wrong. Things are changing, but I don't see blue states signing on to these things.
Neither do I, but we can all dream. Okay. New York has an ERA proposition on the next election ballot that includes gender identity and expression in its text. As far as she knows, this is from Leslie. If passed, how do you think we can use that to move the gender ideology issue forward? What are the likely ramifications of its passage? Excuse me.
My understanding, and I neither live in New York nor am licensed to practice law in New York. My understanding is that the proposal would be to redefine sex to include gender identity throughout New York civil rights law. That would be a disaster for women and girls throughout the state of New York, and I hope it doesn't do that. What can be done to advance it? We'll keep doing the same things that we're doing. You know, we need to keep highlighting the problems associated with redefining sex to include gender identity for any purpose, let alone for public accommodations, which I think would be affected by the New York law.
We have one more question from Nina. Before we, a participant asked about if, religious observers can use belief as a defense. Can those who do not have any religious beliefs, like atheists, can they also use a defense?
So that falls under speech. So let me share some information about two cases of which I'm aware. In a university in the state of Ohio, a public university professor did not want to use a student's preferred pronouns. And this particular professor always addressed his students as either Mr. or Ms., depending on the sex of the student. And the student in question was a male student who demanded to have she, her pronouns and to be referred to as Ms. And the professor had a religious objection to doing that. So the school punished him and he sued the school and he eventually prevailed. And the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that he had a religious right not to be compelled to use so-called preferred pronouns or opposite sex titles in his classroom. So that he prevailed on free speech grounds as well, but his main argument was freedom of religion grounds. Contrast that to a case that came out of the Eighth Circuit where a bunch of students didn't want to go along with their school's gender identity policies, and their parents sued the school district, arguing that their children, the students, were being chilled in their ability to speak freely about matters pertaining to sex and gender. And the Eighth Circuit issued an outstanding opinion, ruling that, yes, in fact, the school district's policies, basically the school district had a policy that said any questioning or criticism of gender identity would be considered bullying and harassment. And the court eventually ruled that that is a complete violation of the student's First Amendment rights. So I'm more interested in First Amendment speech arguments and less interested in First Amendment religious arguments.
Do you have any final thoughts or? That was the last question.
Great, thank you so much. No final thoughts other than just to say things are moving really quickly, and I'm really glad we had this time to talk. I hope that was helpful. I hope that provided some useful background information and some clarity around where we are. I guess the final thing I would just say is be very careful with headlines you read about this, because when I read that case from early last week, I saw a headline that said federal court tosses out Biden's LGBTQ rules. And that's not what the court had done. The court had tossed out the 2021 guidance documents that I think are largely, although not entirely, irrelevant at this point. And so everyone got really excited thinking that the court had tossed out the final 2024 rules, and that's not what it did. Now, skipping forward a couple of days and then another week, actually two federal courts have done that, which is great. And that's cause for optimism. But I just want to urge caution when reading headlines, because the media is quite interested. Mainstream legacy media outlets are quite interested in keeping many of us in the dark about what is actually going on here.
Wow. Thank you for that reminder. Definitely some wisdom that we all need, because the headlines can really just capture us and we don't even read the articles sometimes.
Totally. Thank you. Thanks to everyone who attended, and thank you, Lorraine, for facilitating.
Thank you, and have a good night, everyone.
We'll see you soon.